He wasn't supposed to survive, but the dog wasn't trying to. The snow had fallen for nearly 12 hours without mercy, blanketing the quiet stretch of Montana woodland in a silence so deep it felt like the world had been paused mid-breath, the kind of cold that crept through walls, through skin, through memory itself, and out beyond the narrow trail where Ethan Walker's boots pressed fresh tracks into powder that swallowed sound with every step, the air sharp in his lungs, each inhale stinging like glass as he made his way back toward the small cabin he'd built with his own hands, a place meant for solitude, for healing, for forgetting things he never quite could, and yet something felt wrong long before he saw it. A stillness that didn't belong even in winter, the absence of movement where there should have been at least one familiar shape pacing, waiting, listening, because Rex always waited, always knew the rhythm of Ethan's return even when storms rolled in hard and sudden like this one, even when the sky dropped low and heavy over the trees. But today there was nothing, no sound of paws against wood, no low bark carried on the wind, just the hush of falling snow and the distant groan of frozen branches shifting under weight. And Ethan slowed, his breath catching not from the cold, but from something deeper, something instinctive, the same quiet warning that had once kept him alive overseas, that same feeling now settling into his chest like a shadow he couldn't shake. And then he saw him, just beyond the porch, half buried, where the yard met the tree line, a shape that at first didn't make sense until it did all at once. Rex lying there in the open, unmoving, his body curved but not curled, not tucked in the way any animal would be in this kind of cold. And that was the first thing that felt wrong. So deeply wrong it made Ethan stop dead in his tracks. Because survival had rules, and Rex knew them all, trained, instinctive, written into muscle and bone. But this wasn't survival. This was something else. Something deliberate, and Ethan's heartbeat began to climb, slow at first, then faster as he stepped closer, each footfall heavy now, the crunch of snow. Suddenly too loud in the stillness, his gloved hands tightening at his sides as his eyes fixed on the dog, on the rise, or lack of rise, of his chest, on the way the snow had gathered across his back in an even layer, untouched, undisturbed, and there was no frantic scrambling around him, no signs of struggle, just that quiet, frozen form as if time itself had decided to stop right there and nowhere else. And Ethan swallowed hard. His throat dry despite the cold, his breath coming slower now. Controlled, like he was approaching something fragile, something that might break if he moved too fast, though he didn't yet know what that something was. Only that it wasn't what it looked like, couldn't be, because Rex didn't just lie down in the snow and give up. Not that dog. Not after everything they had been through together. Not after nights that had tested both of them in ways words never could. And yet there he was, still, silent, waiting for something, or someone, to understand, and Ethan felt it then, that shift, that subtle pull beneath the surface of what he was seeing, the sense that he wasn't looking at an ending, not yet, that there was something hidden in the way Rex's body was positioned, in the unnatural stillness that didn't match the story the snow was trying to tell. And Ethan took another step, then another, his boots sinking deeper now as he closed the distance, his eyes narrowing, scanning, searching for anything that might explain it. And that's when he noticed it, barely there, almost lost in the white, a small indentation beneath Rex's chest, a place where the snow hadn't settled the same way, where something disrupted the pattern just enough to catch his eye if he was paying attention. And Ethan was always paying attention, his breath hitching as he stopped just a few feet away now, close enough to see the frost clinging to Rex's fur, close enough to see the stillness in his eyes, open but unmoving, and yet not empty. Not entirely. There was something there, something Ethan couldn't name yet but felt all the same, a quiet message held in that frozen gaze, and the wind shifted slightly, brushing across the clearing, carrying with it the faintest sound, so soft it might have been imagined. But Ethan froze when he heard it, a whisper of something alive, something small, something not coming from Rex at all, and suddenly the cold didn't matter anymore. The silence didn't matter. Nothing mattered except that sound, because whatever Rex had been doing out here, whatever choice he had made in this relentless cold, it hadn't been for himself. The sound came again, faint and uneven, like something struggling against the cold, and Ethan dropped to his knees without thinking. the snow soaking instantly through the denim at his joints as his hands reached forward, hesitating just an inch before touching Rex. Because even now, even with that fragile sound echoing beneath the silence, part of him was afraid of what he would feel, or worse, what he would not. But there was no time left for hesitation, not with that weak, trembling noise threading through the frozen air. So he pressed his hand gently against Rex's side, and the cold hit him like a shock, not just surface cold but deep, unmoving, the kind that did not belong to anything living. And Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay steady as he shifted closer, his breath fogging thick in front of him, his heart pounding now, loud enough that it drowned out everything except that tiny sound, and he leaned in, lowering his ear closer to Rex's chest, searching for anything, any sign at all. But there was nothing, no rise, no rhythm, just stillness that felt too final to accept. And yet the sound came again, slightly louder this time, and Ethan's eyes snapped open, scanning quickly, following instinct more than sight as his hands moved to the edge of Rex's body, brushing away the thin layer of snow that had gathered along his flank, his fingers trembling now not from the cold, but from the growing realization that whatever was making that sound was directly beneath him, and Rex had positioned himself over it, deliberately, carefully, holding that position even as the storm buried him inch by inch. And Ethan swallowed hard as he began to clear more snow, his movements urgent but controlled, revealing a small hollow pressed into the ground beneath Rex's chest, a space carved out by warmth that no longer existed. And then he saw it, just a hint at first, a flicker of movement against the white, so small it could have been missed entirely if not for the way it trembled, and Ethan's breath caught as he leaned closer, his gloved hand sliding beneath Rex's frozen body, just enough to create space. Careful, so careful, because even now he could not bring himself to move the dog fully, not yet, not until he understood what Rex had been protecting. In the moment his hand brushed against something soft, something that moved, something alive, Ethan froze, every muscle locking as the reality hit him all at once, and he shifted his angle, using his other hand to gently part the fur at Rex's underside. And there, curled tight against the last trace of warmth that Rex had given, was a tiny shape, barely larger than his hand, its body trembling in weak, uneven pulses, its fur damp and pressed flat, its eyes still closed as if it had never fully seen the world it had been left in. And for a second Ethan just stared, his mind struggling to catch up with what he was seeing, because this was not random, this was not coincidence, this was something chosen, something intentional. And the small creature let out another fragile sound, a thin cry that barely rose above the wind, and that was enough to break whatever stillness remained in Ethan's chest, his instincts snapping into place as he carefully slid his hands beneath Rex, lifting just enough to free the small body beneath him. And the cold resisted, as if the snow itself did not want to let go. But Ethan did not stop, his movements steady, precise, until finally he was able to ease the tiny form free, cradling it close against his chest. And the moment he did, he felt it, that faint, flickering warmth, fragile but real, and he let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his head dropping forward for a second as relief and disbelief collided in his chest, because Rex had not been lying there waiting to be found. He had been holding that space, shielding it, giving everything he had left to something that could not survive on its own. And Ethan looked down at the small creature in his hands, its breathing shallow but present, its body trembling against him as it fought to stay. And then his gaze shifted back to Rex, still lying exactly as he had been, unmoved, unchanged. And for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, one life barely beginning, the other stretched to its limit. And Ethan's throat tightened as he reached out with one hand, brushing gently against Rex's neck, his voice low, rough, barely more than a whisper as it broke through the cold air. Not a command, not an order, just something softer, something real, something that carried everything he could not say out loud. And as the wind moved through the trees again, carrying the quiet weight of the moment with it, Ethan understood that whatever happened next, whatever came after this, it would never be the same, because the dog had made his choice long before Ethan ever stepped into the snow. And now it was his turn to answer it. The moment stretched thin as frost, fragile and unforgiving, and Ethan did not allow himself to think beyond the next breath, because thinking too far ahead meant facing what he was not ready to face yet. So he shifted his weight, pulling the small, trembling body closer into his chest, tucking it beneath his coat, where what little warmth he had could reach it, his hands moving with careful urgency as he adjusted his grip, ensuring the tiny creature stayed protected from the wind that cut through the clearing like a blade. And only then did he look back at Rex fully. Really look this time. Not as a silhouette in the snow, not as a shape his mind tried to deny, but as the dog who had stood beside him through years that had carved deep lines into his life, and now lay still beneath a blanket of white, unmoving, as if holding on to something even now. And Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath that trembled despite his effort to steady it, as he reached out again, brushing snow from Rex's face, clearing away the frost that had settled along his ears, along the edge of his muzzle, revealing the familiar lines beneath it, the same strong frame, the same quiet presence that had always felt larger than words. And for a second Ethan closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in something closer to gathering strength, because what came next required it. And when he opened them again, there was no hesitation left, only purpose, and he moved, sliding one arm carefully beneath Rex's chest while keeping the small creature secured against him with the other, lifting slowly, testing the weight, feeling the stiffness that had settled deep into the muscles. But he did not stop, did not falter, because there was no version of this moment where he left Rex behind, not after what he had done, not after the choice that lay written in the snow around them. And with effort that burned through his arms and shoulders, Ethan pulled Rex free from the ground, the snow releasing its hold reluctantly as the body shifted, leaving behind the shallow imprint that told the whole story without a single word, a space shaped by sacrifice. And Ethan stood, adjusting his balance as he turned toward the cabin, each step heavy now, slower, deliberate, the weight in his arms more than physical, something deeper pressing against his chest with every movement. And the wind picked up again as if to remind him how fragile this moment was, how easily it could all slip away if he did not move fast enough. And so he did, pushing forward through the yard, through the short stretch of open space that suddenly felt longer than it ever had before, until he reached the porch, his boots thudding against the wooden steps, the sound sharp against the silence. And he shouldered the door open without ceremony, stepping into the dim warmth inside. The contrast immediate, the air thicker, carrying the faint scent of wood and ash from the stove that had burned low during his absence. And Ethan moved quickly, setting Rex down near the hearth with care that bordered on reverence, positioning him on the worn rug where the heat would reach him first, then turning his attention immediately to the small life pressed against his chest, pulling it free from his coat and wrapping it in a dry cloth from the nearby table, his hands steady despite the urgency that pulsed through him, because this part mattered, every second mattered, and the tiny creature responded weakly to the change in temperature, its movements small but present, its breath shallow but fighting. And Ethan leaned closer, watching, listening, counting each fragile rise and fall as if willing it to continue. And for a moment the world narrowed again to just that rhythm, that fragile thread of life he could not afford to lose. And then he forced himself to move again, reaching for a small tin of supplies near the stove, the same kit he had used countless times for minor injuries, for the small, quiet repairs that life demanded. But this was different. This required more than routine, more than habit, and Ethan adjusted the cloth, bringing the tiny body closer to the heat, his fingers checking gently for any response, any sign of strength. And when he felt the faintest push against his hand, barely there but undeniable, something inside him steadied, not relief, not yet, but something close enough to keep him moving. And only then did he glance back at Rex, still where he had laid him, still silent, the firelight casting soft shadows across his form. And Ethan's jaw tightened as he stood, crossing the small distance again, kneeling beside him, his hand resting once more against the thick fur at his neck, not searching now, not questioning, just there, present, because whatever happened next, whatever the cold had taken or left behind, Rex would not face it alone, not now, not after everything. And the fire crackled softly behind them, the only sound in the room, besides the faint, fragile breathing that continued, steady and stubborn, a reminder that the choice made out there in the snow had not been in vain. And Ethan leaned closer, his voice low, barely more than a breath as it filled the quiet space between them. Not a command, not even a plea this time. Just something simple, something that carried weight without needing explanation. And in that stillness, with the storm pressing against the walls and the warmth slowly pushing back, the line between loss and miracle had never felt thinner. Time moved differently inside the cabin, slower, heavier, as if every second had to fight its way forward through the weight of what had been carried in from the snow. And Ethan stayed where he was for a long moment, one hand resting on Rex, the other hovering near the small bundle wrapped in cloth by the fire, his eyes shifting between them as if refusing to choose which one needed him more, because they both did, just in different ways. And the fire crackled low, its warmth beginning to spread, but not yet strong enough to undo what the cold had done, not yet enough to reach the places that mattered most. And Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself into motion. Again, because standing still felt like giving in to something he was not ready to accept. So he reached for another blanket, thicker this time, pulling it from a nearby chair and draping it carefully over Rex's body, not to hide him, but to shield him, to offer what comfort he could even now, even if it came too late. And his fingers lingered for a second at the edge of Rex's collar, brushing against the worn leather, feeling the familiar shape of the metal tag beneath it, a small, quiet symbol of everything they had been through together. And something tightened in his chest, sharp but contained, because there was still work to do, still something alive depending on him. And Ethan turned back toward the fire, kneeling beside the small creature again, adjusting the cloth, bringing it closer to the heat, his hands moving with a steadiness that came from years of training, years of learning how to act even when emotion threatened to take over. And he reached for a small metal cup, filling it with water from a nearby container and placing it near the edge of the hearth to warm, his eyes never leaving the fragile form in front of him, watching for any change, any sign that the warmth was reaching through. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, it did, the tiny body shifting slightly, a weak movement, but enough to draw Ethan closer, his breath catching as he leaned in, his fingers gently touching the small head, feeling the faintest response beneath his hand. And for the first time since stepping into the snow, something inside him eased, just a fraction, enough to let him take the next step, enough to keep going. And he carefully lifted the small creature again, holding it close, while he dipped his fingers into the warming water, testing it before letting a single drop fall against the edge of its mouth, waiting, watching. And after a second that felt far longer than it should have, the tiny form responded, a small movement, a weak attempt to take in what was offered. And Ethan let out a quiet breath, nodding once as if confirming something to himself, as if acknowledging that the fight was still there, that the choice made out there in the snow had not been lost to the cold. And he repeated the motion slowly, patiently, giving only what the small body could take, not rushing, not forcing, because survival was not about speed now. It was about care, about balance, about understanding the line between too much and not enough. And as he worked, the fire grew stronger behind him, the warmth spreading further into the room, reaching the edges of the space where cold had lingered, and eventually reaching Rex as well, the blanket shifting slightly as the heat began to settle around him. And Ethan glanced back again, his gaze softening, not with certainty, but with something close to hope, because he had seen things before, things that did not follow the rules they were supposed to, things that held on longer than they should have. And he was not ready to believe that this was any different, not yet. And he leaned closer once more, his hand returning to rest against Rex's side, not searching for a sign this time, but offering one, a quiet presence, a reminder that he was not alone in this space, that whatever line Rex stood on, he did not have to stand there by himself. And the room settled into a rhythm then. The fire, the faint breathing of the small creature, the quiet stillness of the dog who had given everything he had to protect it. And Ethan remained between them, steady, silent, holding that space the same way Rex had held his out in the snow, not moving away, not turning from either side, because sometimes the only thing left to do was stay, to be there in the space where something fragile fought to become something stronger. And as the minutes stretched and the storm continued outside, pressing against the cabin walls with a quiet persistence. Ethan understood that this moment was not about what had already been lost or what might still be regained. It was about what was happening right now, in this small, warm room, in the space between breath and silence, where something had been saved not by chance, not by luck, but by a choice made in the cold, a choice that had reached beyond itself and into this moment. And he lowered his head slightly, his voice barely more than a whisper as it moved through the quiet air, not asking, not demanding, just present, just steady. And the fire answered with a soft crackle, and the small creature breathed again, and somewhere beneath the blanket, something unseen held its place just a little longer. The warmth in the cabin grew slowly but steadily, pressing back against the cold that had settled deep into everything Ethan had carried inside. And still he did not move far from where he knelt, his presence anchored between the two lives that now defined the space around him, one fragile and flickering, the other silent, but not yet beyond reach in his mind, because Ethan refused to let that line be drawn so easily, not after everything that had led to this moment. And he leaned closer to the small creature again, adjusting the cloth once more as the heat began to loosen the stiffness in its tiny limbs, its breathing gaining just enough strength to be noticed without effort now, each rise and fall still delicate, but no longer fading. And Ethan let his hand rest gently along its back, offering steadiness rather than pressure, a quiet reassurance that did not need words. And for a moment, the only sound in the room was that faint rhythm and the steady crackle of the fire, a fragile balance that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. And then he shifted his weight, turning again toward Rex, because no matter how much of his focus was pulled toward the small life he had uncovered, there was no part of him willing to leave the other behind, not even for a second longer than necessary. And he reached out, pulling the blanket back just enough to expose Rex's chest, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, pressing gently, as if listening through touch alone. And at first, there was nothing, only the lingering cold that had settled deep into muscle and bone. But Ethan did not pull away, did not rush the moment, because he had learned long ago that some things revealed themselves only when given time. And so he stayed there, his hand steady, his breath controlled, waiting. And after a long, quiet second that stretched beyond comfort, he felt it, not a movement, not a clear sign, but something faint, something so subtle it could have been mistaken for imagination, if he had not been searching for it with everything he had. A barely there shift beneath his palm, and Ethan's eyes sharpened instantly, his focus narrowing as he leaned closer, his other hand joining the first, applying just enough pressure to confirm what he thought he had felt. And there it was again, a faint, uneven pulse, weak but present. And Ethan exhaled sharply, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to release the tension that had been building in his chest since the moment he saw Rex in the snow. And he moved quickly now, not in panic but in purpose, adjusting Rex's position slightly, angling his body closer to the fire, pulling another blanket over him to trap the growing warmth, his hands working with practiced efficiency as he reached for additional supplies, knowing that time still mattered, that this was not safety yet, only a narrow opening. And he grabbed a thick towel, warming it near the fire before placing it carefully along Rex's sides, rotating them as they cooled, building heat gradually rather than forcing it, because too much too fast could do more harm than good. And Ethan knew that balance, had lived in it long enough to trust it. And as he worked, he spoke quietly, not because he expected a response, but because silence felt wrong now, felt incomplete after everything that had been held in it outside, his voice low and steady, threading through the space like a guide, something to follow back if Rex was still somewhere close enough to hear it. And the minutes stretched again, but this time they carried a different weight, not the heavy stillness of uncertainty, but the careful tension of something changing, something shifting beneath the surface. And Ethan watched closely, his eyes moving between the rise of the small creature's breathing and the faint, gradual return of warmth beneath Rex's fur, feeling for that subtle pulse again and again until it became just a little more consistent, still weak, still fragile, but no longer a question. And he nodded once, more to himself than anything else, acknowledging the narrow path they were on, the space between loss and return that had not yet decided which way it would go. And he stayed there, refusing to leave either side, his hands moving when needed, still when not, his presence steady in a way that mirrored what had been done for him out in the snow. And as the fire burned stronger and the storm outside continued to fall in quiet persistence, Ethan understood that this was not over, not even close. But for the first time since stepping into the cold, there was something else in the room besides fear, something quieter, something harder to name, but unmistakable all the same. The beginning of a return that had not been promised, only earned, and he lowered his head slightly, his hand resting once more against Rex's side, feeling that faint, stubborn rhythm continue beneath his palm as the small creature beside him breathed a little stronger, and in that shared space between them, the story that had begun in silence found its first fragile answer. The air inside the cabin felt different now, no longer heavy with uncertainty, but layered with something quieter, something that moved beneath the surface without needing to be seen. And Ethan remained exactly where he had been, his presence steady, his attention divided yet whole, because neither life beside him could be left unattended, not now, not when both had crossed into something fragile and unfinished. And he watched closely as Rex's breathing continued to shift, no longer shallow and uneven but gradually finding a rhythm that held, a pattern that suggested not just survival, but return, and with each breath that deepened, each subtle rise of his chest, Ethan felt that same quiet shift inside himself, a tension easing not all at once, but in slow, measured increments, the kind that did not release fully until it trusted what it was seeing, and still he did not rush, did not move beyond what was needed, because moments like this demanded restraint as much as action, and he kept his hand where it was, resting along Rex's side, feeling the warmth now present beneath the fur, no longer distant, no longer fighting to reach the surface. And then it came again, clearer this time, unmistakable, a small movement that traveled from muscle to limb, a faint attempt at motion that broke through the stillness completely. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, his breath catching as his focus narrowed even further, because this was no longer a question. This was something real, something happening. And he spoke again, his voice low and steady, not loud enough to fill the room, but strong enough to exist within it. Something Rex could follow if he was still finding his way back. And for a second nothing changed, the moment holding itself in place as if testing whether it could continue. And then Rex responded, not with strength, not yet, but with presence, his breathing deepening further, his body shifting just enough beneath the blanket to confirm what Ethan already felt. And a quiet exhale left Ethan's chest, not relief exactly, but something close, something grounded in the reality of what was unfolding rather than the fear of what might have been. And beside him, the small creature stirred again, its movements more coordinated now, its fragile body adjusting within the cloth as if beginning to understand the warmth that surrounded it. And Ethan reached over, his hand gentle as he checked its condition once more, feeling the steadiness in its breathing, the faint but growing strength in its small responses, and he nodded slightly, acknowledging that both lives had moved beyond the edge they had been standing on, that both had chosen, in their own ways, to stay. And he adjusted the cloth again, ensuring it remained close to the fire, his movements careful and precise. Because even now, even with the worst behind them, there was no room for carelessness, no space for assumption. And then he returned to Rex, because that connection had not shifted, had not lessened, and he pulled the blanket back slightly, exposing just enough to see, to confirm, and there it was, clear now, a slow but steady rise and fall of Rex's chest, the rhythm no longer fragile, but forming into something stable. And Ethan's hand moved gently along his side, feeling the warmth, the life that had returned not in a single moment, but through a series of choices, each one small, each one deliberate. And he leaned closer, his voice soft but certain, not asking, not pleading, just present, just there, the same way Rex had been out in the snow, holding that space without expectation. And the fire continued to burn behind them, its light steady, its warmth consistent, filling the room in a way that made the storm outside feel distant, almost irrelevant. And Ethan remained between them, grounded in that space, aware of every shift, every breath, every subtle sign that confirmed what had been fought for was still here, still unfolding. And then, slowly, Rex's eyes moved, not opening fully, not yet, but shifting beneath closed lids, a sign so small it could have been missed if not for the way Ethan was watching. And he stilled completely, not wanting to disturb that moment, not wanting to rush what was already happening on its own, and time stretched again. But this time it did not feel heavy, did not feel uncertain. It felt purposeful, as if each second carried them further away from what had nearly been lost, and closer to something that could not be undone. And Ethan stayed there, his hands steady, his presence unwavering, as the line between silence and life dissolved completely, replaced by something quieter, something stronger, something that had been earned not through force but through loyalty, through endurance, through a choice made in the cold that had now found its answer in the warmth. And in that moment, with both lives breathing beside him, Ethan understood that what had happened out there had not been an ending at all, but a beginning he had not seen coming, one that now rested in his hands, fragile and real. And he did not move away, did not step back, because some moments are not meant to be left, they are meant to be held until they become something permanent, something that stays. The moment did not break, it deepened, stretching into something that felt almost suspended in time, as if the world outside the cabin had stepped back to allow this quiet unfolding to take place without interruption. And Ethan remained still, his presence grounded in the space between breath and silence, his hand resting lightly against Rex, as if he could feel not just the steady rhythm beneath the fur, but the weight of everything that had led to this point. And then it happened, not with force, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. Rex's eyes opened, slowly at first, just a fraction, enough to let light in, enough to acknowledge the world that had been waiting for him to return. And Ethan did not move, did not speak, because some moments demanded stillness more than anything else. And he watched as that small opening grew, as awareness began to settle behind those eyes, not fully clear yet, not fully focused, but present, unmistakably present. And a breath left Ethan's chest, soft and controlled, the kind that carried more meaning than any words could hold. And Rex blinked once, slowly, as if testing the space he had come back to, as if measuring whether it was real or something imagined in the long stretch of cold he had endured. And Ethan's hand shifted slightly, just enough to be felt, not enough to overwhelm. And that was when Rex responded, a faint movement of his head, small but deliberate, the first true sign of connection. And Ethan leaned forward just slightly, his voice low, steady, carrying no urgency, only presence, something familiar, something that Rex could recognize without needing to understand. And for a moment the world narrowed to just that exchange, that silent acknowledgement between them. And beside them, the small creature stirred again, its movement stronger now, no longer fragile in the same way. And Ethan reached over, adjusting the cloth gently, checking its breathing, its warmth, and it responded with a small, soft sound that carried through the room like something newly formed, something alive in a way that could not be ignored. And Ethan glanced between them, the connection becoming clearer now, not just in what had happened, but in what it meant, because Rex had not simply endured the cold, he had chosen to stay there, to hold that space, to give everything he had to protect something that could not protect itself. And now that choice had come full circle, returning to him in the form of warmth, of care, of presence. And Ethan's gaze softened as he looked back at Rex, whose eyes were now more open, more focused, tracking the movement of the room, the flicker of firelight, the shape of the man beside him. And there was recognition there, faint but growing, the kind that did not need explanation. And Ethan allowed himself a small nod, not of relief, not entirely, but of understanding, because this was not just survival. This was something earned, something carried through the storm and into this moment without promise, without guarantee. And he adjusted the blanket again, ensuring Rex remained covered, protected, his movements careful and precise. And Rex responded with another small shift, a slight movement of his front leg, weak but intentional, as if testing the strength that had begun to return. And Ethan remained close, his hand steady, offering support without forcing it, allowing that strength to build on its own, because that was the only way it would last. And the fire continued to burn, its warmth steady, its light soft, filling the room in a way that made everything feel contained, held, and the storm outside had quieted further, the wind no longer pressing against the walls but moving softly through the trees, as if the world itself had eased its grip, and Ethan sat there between them, not moving away, not stepping back, because this moment was not something to be left behind. It was something to be witnessed, to be held until it settled into something permanent. And as Rex's breathing continued to strengthen, as his eyes remained open, aware, and the small creature beside them breathed steadily in the warmth, Ethan understood that what had been carried in from the snow was no longer fragile in the same way. It had crossed into something else, something quieter but stronger, something that did not need to be declared to be real, and he lowered his head slightly, his hand still resting against Rex as the silence around them shifted once more, no longer empty, no longer waiting, but filled with something that had returned and chosen to stay. The room did not celebrate the moment. It simply held it, steady and quiet, as if it understood that what had returned needed space more than sound, and Ethan remained close, his presence unchanged, his hand still resting lightly against Rex as the dog's eyes stayed open now, no longer drifting, no longer searching, but settling into the world around him with a slow and deliberate awareness. And there was something in that gaze, something deeper than recognition, something that carried the weight of what had been endured without needing to show it. And Ethan met it without speaking, because words would have felt too small, too limited for what existed between them in that space. And Rex shifted again, a little stronger this time, his front leg moving slightly beneath the blanket, testing, adjusting, finding its place in a body that was still remembering how to respond. And Ethan adjusted with him, not guiding, not forcing, just present, allowing that movement to happen without interruption, because recovery was not something to be rushed. It was something to be respected, and beside them, the small creature stirred more fully now, its tiny form stretching slightly within the cloth, its breathing steady and consistent, no longer fragile in the same way, and Ethan reached over, his fingers gentle as he checked it again, feeling the warmth that had taken hold, the life that had stabilized. And for a moment he allowed himself to pause there, to acknowledge that both had crossed the threshold they had been standing on, that both had moved from uncertainty into something more solid, and yet he did not step away, did not relax into it completely, because he knew better than that, knew that moments like this required continued care, continued presence, and he returned to Rex, his hand brushing lightly along the side of his neck, feeling the strength that was slowly returning beneath the surface. And Rex responded again, his head shifting, just slightly toward that touch. A movement so small but so intentional that it carried more meaning than anything else that had happened so far. And Ethan's expression softened, not into relief, but into something quieter, something steadier, a recognition of the bond that had never been broken, only stretched, only tested, and now restored in a way that felt deeper than before. And he leaned closer, his voice low, steady, carrying no urgency, only familiarity, the kind that did not need explanation. And Rex's eyes followed, focusing more clearly now, tracking that presence, that voice, that connection. And for a moment everything aligned, the fire, the warmth, the breath, the quiet understanding that passed between them without needing to be spoken. And outside, the storm had nearly faded, the snow falling in soft, slow patterns that no longer pressed against the cabin but drifted gently, as if the world itself had eased into stillness. And inside, Ethan remained where he was, not moving away, not breaking that space, because it mattered, because it held something that could not be recreated once lost. And he reached for another piece of wood, placing it carefully into the fire, ensuring the warmth would continue, not just for now, but for what came next, because this moment was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something else, something that would require the same care, the same attention, the same quiet strength that had carried them through the cold. And as the flames rose slightly, casting a stronger light across the room, Ethan looked back at Rex, whose eyes were now fully open, steady, present, and he saw it there, clear and unmistakable, that quiet loyalty that had never left, that had held through the storm, that had chosen to stay even when everything else had fallen away. And Ethan did not speak it, did not name it, because it did not need to be named. It simply existed, solid and undeniable, and he placed his hand gently against Rex's side once more, feeling the steady rhythm beneath it, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, and beside them, the small creature breathed quietly, its presence no longer a question, no longer a fragile thread, but something real, something alive that had been carried through the cold by a choice that now revealed its meaning fully, and Ethan sat between them, holding that space, understanding without needing to say it that what had happened here was not about chance, not about luck, but about something deeper, something that had moved through silence and cold and found its way into warmth and life. And he remained there, still, grounded, as the fire burned steadily and the last traces of the storm faded into quiet, leaving behind a moment that did not ask to be remembered, only to be understood. Morning did not arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly, a pale light pressing gently through the frost-lined windows, softening the edges of the room without disturbing what had been held there through the night. And Ethan noticed it not by sight at first, but by the subtle shift in the air, the way the darkness lost its weight and gave way to something lighter, something that carried the promise of continuation rather than uncertainty. And he remained where he had been, seated low beside the hearth, his back against the worn wood of the cabin wall, one arm resting near the small creature, the other still within reach of Rex. As if even in rest he refused to let that connection break, and the fire had burned down to a steady bed of coals, glowing with a quiet persistence that mirrored the life beside him, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable in its presence. And he exhaled slowly, a breath that carried the exhaustion of the night but none of its fear, because something had changed, something had settled into place without needing to be declared. And he turned his head slightly, his gaze moving first to the small bundle near the hearth, where the tiny creature now lay curled in a position that no longer spoke of struggle but of rest, its breathing even, its body no longer trembling. And Ethan reached over, his hand gentle as he adjusted the cloth once more, ensuring the warmth remained constant, his fingers brushing lightly along its back, as if confirming what he already knew, that it had made it through, that it was no longer standing at the edge. And then he shifted his attention to Rex, because that was where his focus always returned, and what he saw there held him still for a moment longer than expected. Rex was awake, fully now, not just present but aware, his eyes open and steady, watching the room with a quiet clarity that spoke of something deeper than simple recovery. And when those eyes met Ethan's, there was no confusion, no hesitation, only recognition, immediate and complete. And Ethan did not move right away, did not speak, because there was no need. The connection between them filled that space entirely, and Rex shifted slightly, his movement still careful, still measured, but stronger than before, his head lifting just enough to change his view, to take in the room, the fire, the small life that rested nearby, and then returning to Ethan, as if completing a circle that had begun long before the snow. And Ethan leaned forward just slightly, his hand moving to rest along Rex's neck, his touch steady, familiar, and Rex responded by leaning into it, a small motion, almost imperceptible, but full of meaning. And Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not out of fatigue, but to hold that moment fully, to let it settle in a place that would not forget. And when he opened them again, the light had grown stronger, filtering into the room with a quiet insistence, revealing the space not as it had been in the night, but as it was now, calm, grounded, whole in a way that did not need to be explained. And Ethan shifted his position slowly, testing his own stiffness, his body reminding him of the hours spent without movement. But he did not rush, did not break the rhythm that had been built, and he reached for a small container near the hearth, preparing a bit of water again, warming it carefully, his movements deliberate, because even now, even with the worst behind them, care still mattered. And he offered a small amount to the creature first, watching as it responded more clearly this time, its tiny movements purposeful, its strength growing in a way that could be seen without effort. And he nodded slightly, acknowledging that progress, before turning back to Rex, offering the same in smaller measure, careful not to overwhelm. And Rex accepted it slowly, his movements controlled, his focus steady. And Ethan watched closely, his attention unwavering, because this was where recovery continued, not in large steps, but in small, consistent ones, and outside, the storm had passed completely, leaving behind a landscape that would take time to reveal itself again. But inside, the change had already happened, had already taken root, and Ethan remained there between them, not as someone who had saved them, not as someone who had fixed what had been broken, but as someone who had stayed, who had answered what had been given without question. And as the morning light filled the cabin more fully, casting long, soft shadows across the floor, Ethan understood that what had happened here would not be measured by what had nearly been lost, but by what had been chosen instead, and he rested his hand once more against Rex, feeling the steady rhythm beneath it, strong now, present, and he did not speak. Because some things, once understood, do not need to be said at all. The light continued to grow, not harsh or demanding, but steady and patient, filling the cabin inch by inch until the shadows that had once held the night dissolved completely into something softer, something that no longer carried weight. And Ethan stood slowly for the first time in hours, his body stiff but responsive, his movements careful as he shifted his balance, not wanting to disturb the quiet rhythm that had settled around them. And he took a step toward the window, brushing aside the thin layer of frost with the back of his hand, revealing the world outside, a landscape transformed by the storm, untouched and still, the snow stretching out in a clean, unbroken field that reflected the morning light in a way that made everything feel distant and quiet, as if the world itself had paused to recover. And Ethan watched it for a moment, not searching, not thinking, just observing, allowing that stillness to settle into him the same way the warmth had filled the cabin. And then he turned back, because everything that mattered was here, within these walls, and he moved toward the hearth again, lowering himself carefully beside Rex, his hand returning to that familiar place along his neck, the touch steady, grounding, and Rex responded without hesitation now, his eyes tracking Ethan's movement with clarity, his head lifting slightly with more strength than before, and though the motion was small, it carried a quiet certainty, the kind that did not need to prove itself, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging it, not with words but with presence, and he reached for a small bowl, preparing another portion of warm water, this time mixing it with a bit of softened food, creating something gentle, something easy to take in, and he offered it first to the small creature, holding it close, guiding it without force, and it responded, not weakly now but with growing intention, its tiny body leaning into the warmth, into the care, its breathing steady and sure, and Ethan watched closely, his focus unwavering, until he was certain it had taken enough, and then he turned to Rex, offering the same in smaller measure, patient, allowing him to adjust at his own pace, and Rex accepted it, slowly, carefully, each movement controlled, each breath measured, and Ethan remained there, watching, waiting, not rushing the process, because this was not about speed, it was about continuation, about building something that would hold beyond this moment, and the fire behind them burned steadily, its warmth now a constant presence rather than a necessity, and the cabin felt different, not just in temperature but in atmosphere, as if something had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be seen but could be felt in the way everything settled into place, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his hand resting between the two of them, bridging that space without needing to move, and he allowed himself a moment to simply be there, to exist in the quiet that no longer carried tension, no longer pressed in from all sides, but instead held them gently, as if acknowledging what had passed and what had remained, and Rex shifted again, a little stronger this time, adjusting his position on the rug, his movements no longer hesitant but deliberate, and Ethan watched, ready to support if needed, but not interfering, allowing that strength to build naturally, and when Rex's head settled again, turned slightly toward the small creature nearby, something unspoken passed between them, something quiet and complete, and Ethan saw it, not as a moment of surprise, but as something expected, something that had been there from the beginning, and he exhaled slowly, a breath that carried no weight, no urgency, only presence, and he rested his hand once more along Rex's side, feeling the steady rhythm beneath it, strong now, consistent, and he did not need to check again, did not need to confirm what was already clear, and outside, the light continued to spread, revealing more of the snow-covered world, but inside, everything had already been revealed, Everything that needed to be understood had already taken shape, and Ethan remained there, not moving away, not stepping out of that space. Because some moments are not meant to be left behind. They are meant to settle, to become part of something that continues long after the storm has passed, and he stayed with them, steady, grounded, as the day fully arrived, carrying forward what had been chosen in the cold and answered in the warmth. The day did not rush forward. It unfolded with a quiet patience that matched everything that had come before, and Ethan remained where he was, seated low beside the hearth, his presence no longer driven by urgency, but held by something steadier, something that did not need to move quickly to matter, and the cabin had settled into a rhythm that felt almost timeless, the fire burning evenly, the light resting gently across the wooden floor, the air warm and still in a way that carried no tension. And Rex lay beside him, no longer fragile in the way he had been, his breathing deep and consistent, his body resting but not withdrawn, present in a way that filled the space without effort, and when his eyes moved, they did so with clarity, with awareness, tracking Ethan not out of confusion but out of connection, and Ethan met that gaze without hesitation, his hand resting lightly along Rex's neck, not checking, not confirming, just there, because it belonged there, because it always had. And beside them, the small creature stirred again, stronger now, its movements no longer tentative but curious, its tiny body shifting within the cloth as if beginning to understand the world it had been brought into. And Ethan reached over, his touch gentle as he adjusted the wrap, allowing it space without letting the warmth escape, and it responded with a soft, steady sound that no longer carried strain, only presence. And Ethan allowed himself a quiet breath, not relief, not even satisfaction, but something deeper, something closer to understanding, because what had happened here was not something that could be measured in simple terms. It was not about survival alone. It was about choice, about a moment in the cold where something had been given without guarantee, without witness, and that choice had carried forward into this space, into this warmth, into this quiet continuation that now existed between them. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his posture relaxing just enough to reflect what had settled inside him. And he looked once more at Rex, really looked, taking in the steady rise of his chest, the strength that had returned to his frame, the calm awareness in his eyes, and there was no need to question it anymore, no need to hold on to doubt, because what had been uncertain was now clear, what had been fragile was now steady, and Ethan reached out, his hand moving slowly to rest along Rex's side once more, feeling that rhythm beneath his palm, strong, consistent, undeniable, and Rex responded in the simplest way, leaning slightly into the touch, closing the distance not out of need, but out of familiarity, and Ethan nodded faintly, not an acknowledgement of a moment, but of something that had always been there, something that had simply revealed itself more fully through everything they had endured, and the fire continued to burn behind them, steady and warm, no longer a barrier against the cold, but a presence that filled the space with something constant, something reliable, and outside, the snow lay untouched, the world quiet in a way that did not feel empty, but full, as if holding on to everything that had passed without needing to show it, and Ethan remained there between them, not as someone who had finished something, but as someone who understood that this was not an ending, it was a continuation, something that would carry forward beyond this room, beyond this day, shaped by what had been chosen when it mattered most. And he did not speak, did not break the quiet that had formed so naturally around them, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been expressed in action, in presence, in the silent decisions that had defined this moment from the beginning. And he stayed there, his hand resting against Rex, the small creature breathing steadily nearby, the warmth of the fire surrounding them, and in that stillness, with no need for anything more, the story found its ending not in a final moment, but in a quiet grace that remained long after the storm had passed.